Hello everyone, my name is Sue Yeandle. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session in the Care Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future conference. Today we're having a session in the stream on concepts and care in democracy, and I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who is Dr. Sandhya Duggal, who is Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham in the School of Social Policy. And Sandhya is going to talk to us today about asset-based approaches and the ethics of care in the UK. And she's going to speak about what she sees as a shift towards relational practice. So welcome, Sandhya, and I'm handing over to you now.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sandhya Duggal and I'm a research fellow based at the School of Social Policy at the University of Birmingham. In this presentation, I'll be drawing on the ethics of care as a way to examine how asset-based approaches represent a shift in caring relations in practice in the UK, and I'll be drawing upon recent research evidence. Next slide, please. So before we get into the nuts and bolts, I thought it'd be really useful to provide you with a very brief overview of the ethics of care for those who might not be familiar with the concept. Essentially, care ethics is a conceptual framework that seeks to understand how caring takes place. It's based on relational ontology and the understanding that humans are not autonomous individuals and our lives are shaped intrinsically by caring experiences that encompass it, and recognise the importance of relationships and how at the very basic level, care, help and support are an integral part of survival in life. Care ethics is a useful conceptual framework as it can be applied to understanding a number of diverse relationships that exist within numerous contexts such as everyday life, professional practice and the analysis of social and public policies. Next slide, please. So why is it useful to apply and think about the ethics of care? So for two reasons. Firstly, because it recognises that care goes beyond the dyadic relationship between two people, so traditionally the caregiver and the care receiver. And it allows us to explore the multidimensionality of care that exists within wider systems such as policy and local government. And this is really useful because it allows us to recognise that caring exists within a broader socio-political setting, and that's impacted on a number of factors such as relationships and networks. Secondly, it can be applied within the current crisis of care that's facing the UK at the moment in terms of the demographic change that we're seeing with the increase of ageing populations and the expected rise for the need for care services, together with the concern that there's going to be fewer economically active working age people. It's all contributed to the powerful discourse that we have around active ageing and the anticipated care deficit. Within the English social care services, policy has become responsive to these changes. So, for example, we've seen this in the introduction of the personalisation agenda and the ways in which individuals have been given more control and more autonomy in terms of their own service budgets and management of care funds. We've also seen it with the introduction of the Care Act as well, and this posed a potential significant reorientation in terms of the ways in which local authorities were working, in terms of increasing capacity and capability at individual, family and community level, with the ultimate aim of preventing, reducing or delaying the need for adult social care services. So typically, some of these involved a combination of new forms of conversations and relationships with citizens, communities and service agencies, and a fundamental shift towards doing with as opposed to doing to or doing for. Next slide, please. So in this talk, I'll be focusing on recent research findings that explore the implementation of one of these strategic initiatives called asset-based approaches. So for those who might be unfamiliar, asset-based approaches recognise and build on the combination of the human and social and physical capital that exists within local communities. Asset-based approaches essentially are based on these principles of identifying and mobilising individual and community assets, as opposed to focusing on problems or needs or deficits. Next slide, please. So in terms of the project itself, the project was funded by the then called Department of Health, and it explored how local authorities in England were responding to the challenge of prioritising more preventative and capacity building activity within adult social care. And the research design had two main elements. The first was an online national survey that went out to senior leaders in all local authorities, an in-depth case study analysis of innovation in 7 local authorities across the country that were doing innovative work in the field of prevention. And one of the main findings that came from the research was that asset-based approaches emerged as being particularly promising. Next slide, please. We found that a number of different approaches to building capacity in the community were being taken forward. Broadly speaking, they all shared some commonalities in terms of bringing people together, not just to reduce their experiences of social isolation, but also to enable them to do things with and for each other, thereby opening new opportunities, mobilising networks of practical and emotional support for the ultimate goal to improve people's quality of life. And while this was seen as the local authorities as something beneficial to do in its own right, it also had the potential to reduce people's requirement for social care services, especially if their needs were being met better and more organically through everyday interaction, such as those of friends and family and neighbours in the community. Within the case study sites, we had examples of 2 local authorities that were adopting local area coordination, which is a community practical asset-based approach. And they were used to primarily develop community resources. And this was achieved through a salaried local area coordinator being employed with the remit to work out there in the community in order to get to know and understand how the community functions and identify any people who may exist outside of it. Within the local area coordination model, conversations would start with an exploration of what matters to that particular person and their family, including what they might have to offer others as well as what they feel they might need. Such conversations would often start with coordinators asking people what is a good life, as opposed to what services do you need. So the focus is on the person and their aspirations with no predetermined outcomes or solutions. Next slide, please. Our research found many examples of how asset-based approaches such as local area coordination had improved the lives of individuals and families. Beneficiaries that we spoke about the positive impact of these approaches and enabled them to help themselves in more autonomous ways. Primarily, the success of these approaches were primarily attributed to the importance of relationships, connecting and engaging with people in meaningful and personable ways. So I've included a quote here from one of the local area coordinators, which really summarises this point, and they say, "It's on a much more personal level. You're talking about people and valuing people, and this is absolutely the core of local area coordination. Other professionals focus on paperwork, doing the assessments, care and support plans, looking at what your physical needs are and what your aims and objectives are there, which are really, really important for people. But there's no point in looking at social life if you can't get up from your chair. But then looking at the human aspect of what you really want and what's going to give you a good life is also important." So overall, the implementation of these types of approaches represent a shift in how conversation and narratives about care are taking place and where they take place. Within the model of asset-based approaches, they sit with the individual, within families, within communities, and the resources available to them, and not within traditional support services offered by local government. And this allows for people to identify what matters with them in a holistic and meaningful way, whilst providing them with more control and autonomy. Next slide, please. In conclusion, whilst we're aware of the fact that care is political, asset-based approaches represent a fundamental shift in the way we focus and think about the relational aspect of care. And it's moving away from these traditional understandings of it being existing in a transactional concept. And this shift from understanding care from this transactional relationship or commodified purchase from a service towards this new multidimensionality of care has been achieved through these new conversations, through asset-based approaches, and what it looks like when somebody asks you, what does a good life look like for you? Asset-based approaches therefore centres the care receiver through co-production within a doing with rather than doing for relationship, and ultimately allows people to explore the right care for themselves. It allows people to be able to be more in control of their choices. And it is in this way that asset-based approaches could potentially offer a more responsive form of care by placing more power and control in people's hands. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your presentation, Sandhya. I'm sure there will be questions that many people will want to ask about your presentation, and we look forward to discussing some of the issues that you've raised in our conversation at the end of today's presentations. I'm delighted now to invite our second speaker, who is Selma Kadi, who is at the European Centre for Social Welfare Policy and Research in Vienna. And Selma is going to talk to us about gender in the care mix, ideals of care of an older parent and adult child care dyads in Austria.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm going to present research that I've done together with two colleagues, with Rahel Kahlert and Ricardo Rodrigues at the European Centre for Social Welfare Policy and Research. Next slide, please. This is part of the Dead Care Mix project, which focused on the care arrangements in two different familialistic countries, in Slovenia and in Austria, but I will only talk about the example of Austria today. Care cultures, of course, have different dimensions to them. So one of them is, one could think of how social policy shapes different attitudes to care. Another dimension is how different social actors, what kinds of values they invoke when they talk about care. And another dimension of a care culture is, of course, the lived experience of caregiving and care receiving. And this is what we were particularly interested in. And what we know is that care cultures are also shaped by gender and by socioeconomic status, shaped independently, but sometimes also in a way intersecting, so that there are, for example, different expectations on women of different socioeconomic status in terms of providing informal care. And our aim in this research was to be able to better describe Austrian care culture with a focus on the experiences of those who use both formal and informal care. And we thought that this would be particularly interesting because there's this familialistic context in which they are, and at the same time they have experience of both informal and formal care. And what we did is that we looked at ideals of care. So what is their understanding of what good care looks like? Next slide, please. So in this study, we had 24 care dyads who were always made up of an older person receiving care and their main informal caregiver, which was in almost all cases their child, but we also had two grandchildren and one son-in-law. And all of the older people lived in the community. We also have some diversity in terms of gender, so women and men, and then low, middle, and high socioeconomic status background of the participants. In terms of data gathering, we collected 48 semi-structured interviews. So each member of each dyad was interviewed separately. And then all the three authors together with framework analysis, looking for the ideals of care. What do people talk about when they talk about good care? So what did we find? Next slide, please. We found 4 different care ideals. And the first one is the family care ideal. So here, good care is care that is provided by the family. And there are 2 different versions that we found. So one is the one that we call the conditional version. And they're providing care to an older parent is seen as something that is in the context of exchanges that continue throughout life. So you provide care because you have received support previously. And then there's also another version of this family care ideal in which care is provided because of special characteristics of the relationship between parents and children, and it doesn't really depend on whether there is the perception that care or support was provided by the parents before. Then, and this family care ideal was very widespread. Then we have the second ideal. Next slide, please. Which is the personal preference ideal. So here, good care is all about taking into account the preferences primarily of the care receiver, but also to some extent of the possible informal carer. And something that people talked a lot about here was staying in one's home. So when the older person did not want to move and wanted to stay in where they lived, this is often mentioned when people talked about this ideal. Next slide, please. The third care ideal was the involvement ideal. So this was about involving the care receiver in decision making, not only in larger decisions about how care should be provided, but also very much in everyday decisions. So that would then often involve informal caregivers doing a lot of extra tasks, such as going to the bank, withdrawing cash, bringing it to the care receiver. They would then decide how they should be spent, and then the informal carer would go back to the bank to transfer the money there, rather than transferring the money online. Or in the quote that you can see on this slide, the care receiver says that they just decided to cancel part of their formal care without discussing it with the informal carer beforehand. And then we also found a fourth care ideal. Next slide, please. And that's the gendered care ideal. So here care is better provided by a person of a female gender. And this was explained with characteristics that were ascribed to men. So men are not fit for care because they are hurried, they are less well organized. This was a care ideal that was very rare. So we only have 2 or 3 examples where people described this. It wasn't the only way in which gender came up. So people talked also about bodily care, and when they talked about bodily care and formal carers providing bodily care, then they would often say that actually it's preferable if someone of the same gender provides intimate bodily care. And here you also have this quote, I would say a man should take care of a man and a woman should take care of a woman. But this is not the gendered care ideal where caregiving is associated with female gender. Then we were also interested in patterns in terms of who describes which ideal. And here we found that the ideals were actually described across the different socioeconomic status groups. But the unconditional version of the family care ideal, so the one where it's just about parents and children, and it doesn't matter whether care was provided before or support was provided before, was only described in the low and the middle socioeconomic status group. And also women described the family care ideal more often and the involvement in decision-making ideal more often. But again, like with the socioeconomic status groups, all ideals were described by women and by men. Next slide, please. So what do we take from this? I think one way to look at it, on the surface, it looks like the gendered care ideal is very rare, and maybe gender doesn't play that much of a role when we look at the ideals. But another way to look at it could be to say that this gendered care ideal is an explicitly gendered ideal, whereas the others are implicitly gendered as well. Because if the care is provided in the family, very often it will be women who provide this care because of gender relations and the resource distribution. And similarly, with the involvement in decision-making ideal and also with the preference ideal, it's very well possible that people then think, well, the family can provide that better. And then again, it's women who will predominantly provide that care rather than men. Then another thing that we found was interesting was that the ideals were spread across different socioeconomic status groups. And we also looked at the practices that people talked about. And actually, in terms of the practices, there were differences that related to socioeconomic status groups. So, for example, that the cash allowance that exists in Austria was used as a wage for the informal carer is something that only happened in the low socioeconomic status group. Or another example would be that that bodily care would be provided by formal carers in the high socioeconomic status group. And next slide, please. And if we go back to our question, to what we wanted to do, how can Austrian care culture be described in more detail from the perspectives of care dyads using a care mix, then we would argue that on the one hand, familialism is very much reflected in the ideals. I mean, the family care ideal is very widespread. And here it's mostly the conditional version. So this is a question of reciprocity between different generations as well. But then this family care ideal doesn't sufficiently describe the care culture among the group that we studied. And there is also a lot of attention that is paid to individual preferences and to the processes of decision making. And in terms of gender, we would argue that it's intertwined with ideas of care in various ways, even if this explicitly gendered care ideal is very rare. And in contrast to previous research, we found that the care ideals were distributed across the socioeconomic status groups. And it's of course interesting why that's the case. I think one possibility could be that we distinguished very much between practices and ideals, and we did not take practices as examples of ideals, but we really looked at those parts in the data where people talked about good care, regardless of whether they put that into practice or not. Yes, and this is already the end of my presentation. So I'm looking forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selma. That was really interesting, and I think opens up a number of channels of inquiry that we can discuss, and that I'm sure Norah Keating is going to raise in her comments at the end of our session today. So thank you very much indeed for your presentation, and we'll come back to discuss with you further in a moment. Next, I'm going to introduce our speaker from the University of Warsaw in Poland, Weronika Kloc-Nowak. And I'm very pleased to welcome Weronika. She is a partner with us in the Sustainable Care Programme, and so it's very pleasing to have her make a contribution in the conference. And she's going to talk about grandparenting in Poland in the age of restricted mobility, and she's going to look at how COVID-19 pandemic has affected practices of local and transnational grandparenting. So over to you, Weronika. Welcome.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present this research on grandparenting during the pandemic, which is still with us. So as Sue has already introduced the title of the presentation, I will talk about the practices of grandparents, both local and transnational grandparents during the pandemic and during the restrictions linked to the pandemic. And today's analysis has been prepared together with Professor Louise Ryan as a part of the project, which is on the next slide, please. On the project entitled Grandparenting at a Distance, Beliefs and Practices Regarding Relationship with Grandchildren in Spatially Mobile Polish Families. I lead the project, and Professor Ryan is kind of a foreign partner in the project, a partner of our team. Next slide, please. So my research background is in transnational families, and in this scholarship, grandparents feature first of all as carers for children left behind by migrating parents, but also as persons who migrate themselves either in a circular, temporal way or a more settled one and their mobility is tied to offering care for their grandchildren. There are many types of this grandparental care, many different arrangements. If we look at them by the dimensions of aim, temporal arrangement, and also spatial location of the care offered. And when they do not offer, look after grandchildren in person, there's a lot of caring about grandchildren at a distance, increasingly thanks to the information and communication technology. Next slide, please. So the context for my study is the Polish society, which is also a familialistic one, as the ones mentioned in the previous presentation. A society where grandparenting is quite a universal experience of older Poles, and also the intergenerational care obligations are very strong and widely supported. So in this society, I believe that migration is a challenge because it hinders the possibility of practicing these social norms and ideals of family care. And next slide, please. So when I designed the study back in 2018, I had a puzzle back in my head. I was curious whether grandparenting across borders in transnational families is indeed that special, that different from grandparenting at a distance, but within one country. That's why I designed the study in a way that would allow to differentiate the effect of borders from the effect of distance within the country. It was like this back in 2018, but when the pandemic started, we started to experience distance in a completely different way, and basically our doorstep has become a border that we had to cross if we wanted to be in touch with many of our family members. And next slide, please. So in this project, in this analysis, we still had to rely on the conceptual framework and the concepts developed earlier in the analysis of migrants' family practices. And the first framework we apply is the idea of migrants' family networks, how they are maintained yet evolving throughout the life course of family members, and for especially the role of grandparents in childcare as a part of the network of support for migrant families differs at different stages of family life. At the same time, grandparents the ties with them are maintained over time by migrant families as a part of keeping the return option open, as a part of keeping the ties in Poland strong for potential return. Next slide, please. Another part of our analytical framework is the concept of ethnomorality of care. This concept has been developed by my research team in the previous project that we've done at the Center of Migration Research in Warsaw. That was a project about migration and aging. And in this framework, we have kind of three levels or three elements. The top one, moral beliefs or social norms, are the ideals about care in the family. We have care arrangements, which is the practices of care in the family, and the kind of innovative element level is the care intentions. We see it as a discursive element, as a way to focus on our analysis on the wishes for future arrangements, on the contractual statements, also on the justifications and excuses for practices that do not satisfy the social norm. Next slide, please. And the last part is the concept of unsettling events, developed originally by Magella Kilke and Louise Ryan. And it proved very useful because during the project, we had to face the COVID pandemic as yet another unsettling event, not foreseen, but affecting clearly our participants and the topic of our analysis. Next slide, please. Yes, so the data used in this analysis and in the project is on the one hand data subject to a secondary analysis. This is the pre-2018 qualitative interviews, for example, from this ethnomorality of care data set. And also I have newly gathered data in July 2020, when the first wave of pandemic was kind of over and we experienced a bit of relief. I conducted 4 focus group interviews with grandparents, with women and men aged 50 plus, with grandchildren in different locations. And I'm actually during further data gathering, because I do a second wave of focus group interviews online this month, in a completely different, much more difficult epidemiological situation. But for today's presentation, I focus on the July data. Next slide, please. So just to give you a context, before the pandemic, care-related mobility was at the core of family practices of Polish transnational families. Often the travel to care was very meticulously scheduled, and the care stays abroad were prolonged. For example, grandparents, usually grandmothers, would take turns to care for an infant, for a child born abroad. When the children were older, there were complex family summer holiday plans, sometimes, as in the case of the quotation here, if you could enlarge it, please. Families would plan in a very detailed way. Like in this family, the grandmother counts and asks why the granddaughter is a day longer in the other town, and then there's a change of plans and the granddaughter stays with you shorter, because it must be even the exact number of days spent with each grandmother. So next slide, please. We can see that with the COVID-19 pandemic, all this type of scheduled transnational mobility has been heavily disrupted. My interviewees talked about cancelled visits in Poland, cancelled visits abroad. Then when travel was again allowed, it was still subject to changing regulations. Often there was a risk of quarantine after arrival, making a short visit impractical. And there were a lot of fears associated with potential travel abroad. Next slide, please. If caring in person was not possible, there were other material forms of caring applied during the pandemic. And the key theme was the theme mentioned were the face masks. They were both received by the older participants, but also given sent to the families abroad. For example, one of my participants talked about sending children's size face masks in a parcel to the UK. Apparently, at that stage, the family had the impression that this product was not available in the UK, and the family wearing these, children wearing these masks were, they stood out on London streets, and everyone was interested in where did this migrant family get the product from. Next slide, please. As regards local families, local caregiving was also disrupted, and local contacts were disrupted. For some participants, even with their local family members, the only contact was the telephone for several weeks. They approached all the regulations and staying at home very strictly in the first phase of the pandemic. Grandparents would isolate from their grandchildren not only to protect themselves, but also sometimes to protect the oldest cared for generations. So we have to see the grandparents in their 50s and in their 60s as a part of a 4-layer generational structure. Interestingly, when there was somebody in the family who would not comply with the safety regulations, an ultimatum could be used to make them behave safely. As in this example, if you could enlarge. So there was this 91-year-old woman who would go out without the mask, go into gatherings such as the church. And the family said, when my son, her only grandson, said that he would come with his children only if she stays at home, well, she was finally at home for 2 weeks, and we came to see her. So this grandson and great-grandchildren were an argument that could make this older woman stay at home and care a bit for herself. So there was one safe family meeting, but afterwards she started to behave in this reckless way, as her daughter-in-law commented, and she didn't care for her safety anymore. Next slide, please. Yeah, in the project, I'm also interested in communication practices, whether there were some innovations in families without the transnational component, in families that experience distance without border. And of course, during the pandemic, there was this convergence. Everyone had to learn these communication tools and start to use them. And this quote, I liked it a lot. It's not actually from any of the focus groups. It's from a dissemination event I organized around my project. A Polish migrant living in Ireland commented on the changed perception of transnational family members by the local people. So during the lockdown, they all went online. Families all went online. It gave my mom and my mother-in-law, having children abroad, the opportunity to be understood by their friends. Because my mom and my mother-in-law only contact us online. We talk at least once a week. And for them, it was normal. And it was just like their friends said that only now, they know how our moms feel. So I believe that this expresses very well the fact that we're all in this together, and also the local people had to learn and could experience being so much away from their close family members. So to conclude, next slide, please. To conclude, we believe that the transnational family mobility practices in the scale that used to be practiced before the pandemic can no longer be maintained, and the families will have to adapt to this. And it's not only the impossibility to travel for holidays, for some in the summer, but it's also the fact that it's no longer easy to travel to offer hands-on care in case of emergency, in case of illness of the older parent, but also in the situations where a grandchild is born, which was such a special moment when the grandparents traveled abroad to visit the migrant family and meet a new family member. The pandemic has proved that the local networks, the support available in the neighborhood is crucial, and it's become crucial both for the migrant parents and grandchildren who cannot now rely on their grandparents, but it's also important for the older grandparents who are in Poland and cannot count on their children to arrive if there's an emergency. The pandemic hinders the possibility of fulfilling childcare obligations, the normative ideals. And we believe that grandmothers suffer more because they are traditionally expected to care more. So they have lost more by not being able to travel to care for their grandchildren. And in the long run, sustaining the family care norm requires decisions either to return or to take aging parents abroad. And I believe that it also applies to geographically dispersed families within the country, where also some young families that live in the metropolitan areas may think of going back to the towns or even countryside of origin to be closer to their parents and to be closer to grandparents and to the asset of grandparental care. So next slide, please. So it's the last slide. If you would like to read this analysis in full, we have a chapter forthcoming in the Handbook of Migration and the Family, and I hope to have a lot of more analysis of this fresh data that come from the focus group interviews that I'm also doing in 2021, and I'll be comparing how this approach of grandparents develops along the pandemics, as it's still with us a year into the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Weronika. That was also a really interesting presentation with lots of fascinating detail. And so I'm now going to invite our discussant for this session, who is Professor Norah Keating, who is, we're very fortunate to have as our discussant in this session. Norah is a very significant scholar of family studies, and we've been privileged to have her as part of our team in the Sustainable Care Programme. And Norah has affiliations at the University of Alberta in Canada, as well as at Swansea in the UK. And I'm delighted to hand over to Norah now for her to share some of her reflections and raise some questions about some of the presentations that we've heard earlier in this session. So over to you, Norah.
Thank you so much, Sue. It really has been very interesting to hear all of the presentations. And as Sue says, I'm particularly interested in families and family relationships. I'll talk a little bit about one of the things I saw in these presentations, which is the tension or the gap between what it is we believe about families and what they should do, and what the family practices are, and what the constraints there are on those family practices. We have powerful beliefs about families that are really universal, although play out somewhat differently in different locations, about what families should do, about how they're able to do this, and about where it is we might wish to intervene, if at all. This session is placed within a theme called Caring Relations Towards Sustainable Arrangements with Well-Being Outcomes. Care, well-being, and sustainability have been core concepts throughout the Sustainable Care Program. The presentations today, I think, are fine examples of research that addresses these constructs. What's so interesting about them is they come at these issues quite differently. They use different lenses, from a conversation about asset-based to thinking about cultures of care beliefs, to how we need to keep rethinking transnational care and how families are part of all of that. And finally, and interestingly, a presentation on particularly on care in the context of COVID-19. These presentations are interesting as a group because the research was undertaken and is grounded in beliefs and situations in 4 different areas. We have presentations from Austria, from Poland, from the UK, and from Ghana. And one of the things I always find fascinating is that not only is our research set within particular contexts, but of course we as researchers are as well. They raise a number of questions for me, and I'd like to make just a general comment about those, and then perhaps ask a question of each of the presenters in terms of what their work means and where we might understand it, how we might understand it, as we come to some of our big conclusions about the Sustainable Care Program and its contributions. One of the big questions that all of the presentations raise for me is, whose well-being are we thinking about when we're talking about care and carers? Often we're focused on the well-being of those people who we often call care receivers. Sometimes, as in these presentations, we're talking about those who are positioned as carers. And we think about care to those with chronic health problems, but also those kinds of everyday care obligations to others in families. I think we don't still have a good sense of who are the players when we're thinking about care and how lives are influenced beyond an individual or a dyad in care. One of the issues that has been a large one in this program is the whole question about sustainability. And what we mean by sustainability. At least one of the presentations speaks to the whole question about fiscal sustainability. And is that what we mean? Is sustainable really a matter of fiscal responsibility from the point of view of a public sector? But what are the social responsibilities? Certainly there were themes of gender through these presentations, but also themes related to familism, the tension between individuals, families, and the states, and what would we see as well-being from a social point of view. And finally, not so much part of these presentations, but I think a question that needs to be asked broadly, is sustainability a matter of supporting chronic health conditions, or perhaps of increasing healthy life expectancy? And for whom are we thinking about increasing healthy life expectancy? Let me turn briefly to each of the presentations and make a comment and then perhaps raise a question. Sandhya's presentation, I think, is interesting in that she focuses it on the ethics of care and what she calls relational practice. Her work suggests to me that what we're talking about here is really reminding ourselves that we need to be particularly respectful of the person who is the one with the chronic health conditions. So perhaps not so much a specific dyad or care relationship, but a perspective on how it is we support and hear the person receiving care. It's interesting to me that part of asset-based approaches seem to be based in how communities could be more supportive to people with chronic health conditions, and what a supportive community looks like. The question I have is how we find the balance between being supportive of someone, being respectful of their choices, but not pulling back so much in the cause of allowing a person to find their way that we risk letting them struggle without the kind of support they need. So I think that's a question, Sandhya, that I'd really be interested in you addressing. Your work fits very nicely with the ideas of person-centered care, which have been very important to us. Selma, your work, I think, does a lovely job of addressing this whole question about what are our beliefs about family care, and particularly what are our beliefs about who should deliver that care and who should decide about that. And I think it's a fascinating study where you begin to deconstruct this notion of whether it's simply families should provide care or states should provide care, giving us an idea of the different kinds of beliefs. I think mostly among carers. I wasn't clear in your dyads whether your results were primarily voices of the carers or also of people being cared for. But I like the idea, and what you're getting at is questions about under what circumstances is family care ideal, and even what do we mean by ideal, and the extent to which people should have preferences to care or not, and whether or not we have a sense that, at least for some people, good care is the care that that older person wants. And I had to smile at your quote from an older person who decided that they didn't want to have home care anymore. And I just wonder about the well-being of that carer over time as she picks up the pieces. I'm interested in your finding that beliefs about care being gendered, are really not that strong. But you acknowledge that the practice still is that most care is provided by women. And I think that's when we really need to keep an eye on what are our ideals and our beliefs, and what is the practice, and what really leads us to familism by default, which is you have to care because there are no other options. Weronika, I think your presentation was really important for a couple of reasons. One is that you are talking about care that's not because of chronic health conditions, but because of beliefs about generational connections in families. And I think it's a nice juxtaposition to our sense from the other presentations about who should do what and who should provide care. Because you talk about high care obligations among Polish families, but those are about the beliefs that grandparents should be involved in the care and support of their families. You use the word duty, and I think that's a fascinating one. So how do those duties, how is that context of duty softened in any way as people are migrating elsewhere, I think often to the UK, where perhaps those sense of care obligations aren't as strong? And do they soften over time in migrant families? Maybe you don't know the answer to that, but I'm interested. I'm also really interested in the whole question about whether it's borders or distance that makes the difference or that can make things difficult for families. I live in Canada, where we have vast differences. And I think our ideas about how far is too far maybe are very different than in smaller countries. But like Poland, during the pandemic, it hasn't mattered so much because we have not been able to travel within the country or even within a region. So I think there's much more to be learned about borders versus distance and how those are going to play out differently. Finally, the presentation by Kofi, I think, gives us a different perspective on the whole question of what it is that family members do in terms of care and how that has changed or been truncated within the context of COVID. Although Kofi doesn't say so explicitly, he does say families, he doesn't talk about familism specifically, but I think he reflects a culture in which families are expected to provide long-term care. We know he comes from a country in which there isn't a great deal of formal care provision. So one of the things that I think is interesting is the whole question about how older adults' satisfaction with their care has changed over COVID and under what circumstances they feel like the care has not been adequate, and to what extent we understand that in the context of COVID, perhaps restricting visits or assistance from other family members, and how much of it is part of a care context in which there isn't a lot of other support available. So I want to thank you all. It's been fascinating. I think there are some real similarities across the presentations. And I would leave you with this big question about if there are gaps between beliefs and behavior, what does that tell us about how we move forward? So thank you so much.
Thank you, Norah. That was really a really helpful set of observations and queries and questions for our speakers to think about. And I'm going to start by asking Sandhya if she would reflect on how we find the balance between supportive care and care that is respectful of choices that may involve risk taken by older people. So perhaps we can first hear from Sandhya her thoughts about that question raised by Norah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think these are all good points that have been raised in terms of how do we make sure that we achieve a good balance in terms of providing people with the necessary support that they need, but also making sure that they don't essentially drop off from those service supports as well. And I think there's an argument to make here that actually asset-based approaches, the interventions that I mentioned, such as local area coordination in my talk, can be seen to have the greatest potential impact with those whose needs are less substantial and are less likely to escalate in terms of formal support services. Therefore, the goal essentially then in terms of asset-based approaches is to make sure that what's being made available in the community is more joined up and that they receive additional support from services so that people don't go on to need more intensive care and support. And I think in order to do this, it goes back to kind of the things that I mentioned about relational ways of working, centering service users, beneficiary at the centre of their conversations about what matters to them. And again, that centres around this whole idea around doing with as opposed to doing to and doing for. And the ultimate goal, I think, for local government, local authorities is to enable citizens and people to live the best way that they possibly can and not to inadvertently build dependence. And I think this is an important consideration for those that are working within local authorities to consider and reflect on that. Does this mean acquiring different different types of skills in order to provide and implement these new ways of working sufficiently. Thank you.
And then I'm going to come to the next speaker, and I'm going to invite Selma to respond to Norah's questions about differences in beliefs about family care and who should both deliver care and who should make decisions about it, were some of the points that Norah raised. And I'm sure, Selma, you've got other reactions as well to what Norah had to say. So I'm going to turn over to Selma now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much for the comments. I think one of the things that you mentioned was this finding that the gendered care ideal is very rare, but then on the other hand, women provide a majority of the informal care. And I think my first idea would be that this clearly tells us that there's a need to align the welfare system with the beliefs, maybe, to support caregiving among women and men. But I think that we are also maybe far away from that, because what we found was this: it doesn't really matter, but we didn't find people saying, well, really good care should be provided by women and men. And I think if people said that it's valuable to receive care from both genders, maybe it would be easier to move towards these larger changes that are necessary. So, I mean, from a completely different field, but if we think about care for small children, I think there's an argument that by some people that it's actually valuable that you're not only cared for by women, but also that there are male kindergarten teachers as well. So that was one thing that I wanted to respond to. And also I wanted to say something about what you said in the beginning about the everyday care obligations as well, apart from like the small things in the different ways care is provided. Because what I found quite interesting is that in our interviews, there were such big differences when people talked about support they had received earlier in their lives, when they explained the family care deal and these intergenerational exchanges, and it was part of that. And for some people, it was, well, my mother has given birth to me. This is most you can expect. She supported me more than anybody could ask for. And then other people who said, well, they raised me, they did this and that for me, but this is not really exceptional, and it doesn't really mean that I have any obligations. Yeah, so these are just two things I wanted to immediately respond to.
Thanks, Selma, and I'll give Norah the opportunity to come back on that if you like, Norah. But before I do that, it just occurs to me that certainly in the UK context, in the studies I've conducted, I've observed that there's often a gendered division of labour in caring, that there are a range of care and support needs that particularly an older person may need over the years that precede their final decline. And those are sometimes involve things which women are seen as good at doing, and sometimes they're things which older people rely on the men in their families to do for them. And I just wondered if, in talking to the families that you interviewed, if that came up as an issue, that it might be that it's how we define what care is, that, you know, maybe sometimes we're not actually considering some of the things that men might be doing in their families that might be important to family members, but we perhaps don't perceive them as care.
Yeah, well, I also recognize that from other research, but in the interviews that we conducted, it wasn't, I cannot think of people making that distinction even. Yeah, so whatever the reason is, but we didn't find that.
Okay, and Norah, do you want to come back on to Selma?
Yes. What are the societal level beliefs about who's deserving of support? So there we get into familism at the cultural or public societal level. And what are those, and understanding what those beliefs are. Because in places where there's a powerful belief, in Ghana, for example, that really, I mean, government should stay outside of families. That's private family business. Then there's less impetus, I think, to intervene than there might be in another setting in which there's a belief that people should be able to, as Karajuke says, have a life, and that could be outside of care. So I think those might be other avenues for us to pursue.
So thank you very much, Norah. So I'm now going to invite Weronika to respond to some of the points which Norah raised in her discussant comments about her paper, but particularly what struck me about Norah's comments was that she was talking about this issue of the difference between borders and distance, and I wondered if that was something you wanted to comment.
As regards borders and distance, indeed, the contrast between these two concepts seemed much bigger when I designed the study, and I think the pandemic has changed it a lot. There was actually even the concept of distance has become so prominent in the everyday discourse. We talk about social distancing, about keeping the physical distance, but how can you guarantee keeping physical distance if you meet your 5-year-old grandchild? It's impossible. Although maybe the children will also start to learn physical distance, which would be so sad if we socialize children to keep physical distance. And I believe that this may change the experience of grandparenting, which is so much about hugging, about expressing your love and affection in this physical bodily sense. And at the same time, I think we will potentially reconsider the idea of multi-generational households, because on the one hand, they may increase the risks if there is a child going to daycare or school and an older or frail person with a lot of health conditions. But at the same time, such a household is more, I would say, care-proof. For example, when there's no external institutional childcare available, there is more members, including grandparents, within the household to offer care, so that the parents don't have to fare on themselves. So that's what I said, that the household, the doorstep of our household becomes a more important border than before. And indeed, when I prepared the study, when I read about the sociology of family, about the studies done on grandparenting, I could see that the North American perspective was much different than the American family scholars were actually taking distance and large distances as an important dimension for families. I guess in Europe we have not put enough attention to this, and we should start to look at it more. And you have emphasized the concept of duty that I used in my presentation. It was actually taken from a standard, I think, European social survey question. But indeed, I think that this concept of duty is not controversial to a majority of polls. Indeed, there's this strong sense of family intergenerational connectedness, and some people take family for granted and they overuse it. For example, they believe that it's a duty of the grandparents to write off their property, their apartment to the younger generation even before they die. And so there may be abuse of this family duty, but also in terms of care. For example, still women are expected to retire early. Once there's a grandchild, they are expected to resign from work in order to provide childcare. Is this concept softened due to migration? Well, my first observation regarding the grandparents is that not really, but it may be an effect of the method. I concentrate here because I talk about the results of focus group interviews, and in a group interview, people would be more conformist to the social norm. So I'll have to compare it with the results of my survey of grandparents, because fortunately, just before the pandemic, I managed to conduct a nationwide survey of grandparents, and I have these normative questions addressed there as well. So I'll definitely dig more into this. Still, I believe that it's a duty not only for the grandparents, it's also a duty. These intergenerational connections are also a duty for the middle generation, for the parents, for the adult migrant children, because it's their duty to sustain these relationships, to make sure that the grandchildren, for example, speak Polish, to be able to communicate with grandparents, to actually organize these trips, and to make sure that the number of days spent with each grandmother is equal. So it's a duty for everyone, and it's up for us to see, because the second generation of Poles raised abroad is now becoming young adults, and we will have to study whether they still find it a duty to remain in touch with their grandparents to sustain these relationships. And how will they do it, for example, if they cannot travel that frequently?
Thank you very much, Weronika. I'm now going to invite Selma to make a few comments.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Weronika whether she has made any observations regarding the age of the children and the ICT use, and whether people found it very difficult also to interact with small children, because of course ICT can enable many things, but I think that it makes a big difference whether your grandchild is 14 years old or 4. So I don't know if you have had anything about that in your interviews.
Weronika, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. Actually, very small children, babies, are an attractive object of internet. You would not call it conversations, but this family displays. There's research also done among parents that actually it's quite an important event to display a baby on camera using Skype or any more modern communicators. So it may sound bizarre, but it's especially for the grandparents of what they call it themselves in my group interviews of the pandemic children. So there are already grandparents who have not had an occasion to see their grandchild because the grandchild was born abroad during the pandemic, and for them it's the only way they can experience a grandparenting, often by looking at the child in the camera. So it's not that bad. And then with preschoolers often become quite active users of communication applications. So they want to show their activities. One of my this month's group participants talked about one of the grandchildren starting the connection to show off what her younger sister was doing. So it's not that bad. I have not encountered it yet in my research, but from literature, it stems that actually around 10 or 12, it starts to be a problem because the children are no longer interested in taking part in these family displays. So teenagers may become active and prominent users of applications, but they may also be reluctant and simply don't want to take part in the show anymore. On the other hand, they may be helpful to the grandparents because they are the digital generation. So if the grandparents need support in the technologies, they sometimes mention that it was the grandchild who helped them, not the middle generation, not their child, but the grandchild. So it's very complex, and it's not a linear relationship.
Thank you, Weronika. Now back to Norah for perhaps a final word based on your wide knowledge of this field and the learning that we're all doing as we've moved into what seems like a different world in the last 12 months. The pandemic and life seems to have changed in so many ways. Over to you, Norah.
Thank you, Sue. I think in closing, the big question for me that we've touched on and hopefully will be developed in some of your writing is getting a better sense of the relationships of care, not the structural ones, but the ways in which people relate to each other across time, whether it's in grandparenting relationships or in transnational care relationships. Some carers are involved, grandparents, for a very long time, but also chronic care may be involved for many, many years. How do those relationships change not only between the two people involved, but with others in the family? And how does that color the way they move forward as families? So another big question that certainly is of interest to me and that you've raised and begun to highlight. Thank you all. It's been a stimulating conversation, and I hope that it's one that will continue in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Norah. And can I close by thanking all the speakers for their presentations and for sharing their work with us, and say how fascinating I think the session has been and how important it is to understand the different currents of change that are affecting the lives of people of different generations and in different family relationships around the globe. There's so much for us to learn, and so much that we could do to make people's lives fuller of well-being and hopefully the positive side of some of their relationships more sustainable. So thank you all for your contributions, and I'm now going to close the session.